All right, everyone. I believe with that, we are ready to proceed. Good afternoon, everybody. And this, of course, is the estate of Genesis Petrillo versus Peony Estates and Harper Martini. My name, as mentioned, is Judge Fleury, and we're ready to proceed with appearances if the parties are ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Travis Pico, and I'm joined here today by my co-counselors, Ms. Addison Pruitt.
Good evening, Your Honor.
And Mr. Matthew Schreiner.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
And together we are advocating on the behalf of the estate of Mr. Genesis Petrillo.
Thank you. And for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Dalton Davis, and I, along with my co-counsel, Randall Shirey, and Michelle Deutsch, we represent the defendant, Harper Martini, in today's case.
Good afternoon. Now, before we proceed to opening statements, I'll put this question to the plaintiff first. Do you have any housekeeping matters you'd like to take care of?
Yes, Your Honor. Seeing this is our first time in your court, I'd first like to inquire, what are your preferences for sitting or standing during statements?
I have absolutely no preference. Whatever you are most comfortable doing and whatever best suits the particular locale that you're at.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we would like to invoke Rule 615, constructively sequestering all witnesses barring party representation. For today's trial, we have no party representative.
Very well.
And Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to designate our party representative as Harper Martini.
Very well.
At this time, Your Honor, we'd also like to invoke Rule 603, which is the pre-swearing of all witnesses.
All right. Defense, any issues with that whatsoever?
No, Your Honor, that's our understanding as well.
All right. We'll consider the rule invoked.
Your Honor, we'd also like to turn your attention to some case law that might be relevant in today's case. The first being Burdett versus Copenhaver, which simply states the elements of civil battery are 1, an act by the defendant, 2, an intent to cause harmful or offensive contact on the part of the defendant, and 3, harmful or offensive conduct or contact to the plaintiff.
Okay.
The second bit of case law is Defendifer versus Schroeder, which simply states that a plaintiff in a civil case must establish all the elements of the claim by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning that all elements are more likely than not true.
All right. Defense, do you have any issues at all with the plaintiff's interpretation of that case law?
Your Honor, that's our general understanding of the law as well.
Very well.
Your Honor, we'd also like to note Stipulation 9, which simply states that all other food and drink on the night of June 7th has been tested, and none of it was positive for organophosphates.
Any issues at all with that stipulation, defense?
Your Honor, specifically Stipulation 9 says any food and drink at the rehearsal dinner, not just any food or drink that was at the winery that night.
Very well. And plaintiff, are you comfortable with that restriction to at the rehearsal dinner?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
And with that, Your Honor, we're ready to proceed.
Okay. And defense, any additional housekeeping matters?
Your Honor, just that for the purposes of timekeeping in today's trial, that we would request permission for the timekeepers to use the chat function on Zoom to be able to clearly post our time throughout openings and examinations.
Absolutely. No issues whatsoever on that. I've noted previously in other trials that I've taken part in throughout this weekend that sometimes with timekeeping, we can run into challenges when exhibits take a little bit longer than otherwise expected to load. So with that being said, we will go ahead and note that timekeepers may pause while an exhibit is being loaded until it is shown on the screen. Now, with that said, if that is shown to be being abused in any sort of way, then of course, there will be follow-on action on that.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, defense, any other matters?
No, Your Honor. With that, the defense is ready to proceed.
Very well. And plaintiff, you are also ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, we'll move forward with opening statements. And plaintiff, I'm going to switch over to speaker view here. I would encourage everyone else to do the same. And the floor is yours.
May it please the court. Every parent's wish is that their child will meet someone that loves them, cherishes them, and makes all of their dreams come true. You raise your son or daughter from the time they take their first steps, encouraging them so that one day they can leave the nest. That is most parents. In 2012, two young people met and fell in love. Genesis Petrillo was a young PhD candidate who was just trying to make his way in life. And when he met Casey Soto, a young girl from Midlands, the two of them immediately hit it off. They started introducing each other to friends and family, and a couple of years later, they got engaged. They had plans to get married and move to France to start a life together. A plan that Casey's overprotective mother, Harper, was not a fan of. You see, ladies and gentlemen, today you're going to hear about a parent who didn't want her child to leave the nest. You'll hear that Harper wanted Casey to stay and take over the family business, a winery named Peony Estates. The tension between Harper and Genesis built in the months leading up to the wedding. And you'll see that things came to a head the night of the rehearsal dinner. The evidence will show that on that night, Harper decided to take things into her own hands. You see, in the year or so leading up to the wedding, the winery had begun to use a particularly lethal brand of pesticides. Now, I want you to pay attention to where that pesticide ends up. On the night of the rehearsal dinner, Harper made a toast to Genesis. She presented him with a bottle of wine as a gift, a peace offering. That bottle of wine later tested positive for containing organophosphate pesticides. You see, instead of having her dream wedding on June 8th, Casey had to go to the hospital in her wedding dress and receive the news that the love of her life had passed away. Because Harper had a problem, she had a plan, and she had a poison. You're going to hear from 3 witnesses today who will tell you about the events leading up to and following the night of June 7th, 2019. Firstly, we'll call Angel Rodriguez, a close friend of the couple. Angel will tell you that Genesis was afraid of Harper, afraid of what she might be planning. Secondly, we'll call Dr. Jimin Kwan, the attending physician, the night that Genesis came into the emergency room exhibiting symptoms of pesticide poisoning. Dr. Kwan will tell you that every single test he ran confirmed his suspicions. Pesticides. Finally, you're going to hear from Casey Soto herself, the defendant's daughter, Genesis's bride. She'll tell you that the defendant repeatedly threatened Genesis in the days leading up to the wedding. She'll tell you about the heartbreak that she has experienced after losing the love of her life. Members of the jury, today we represent the estate of Genesis Petrillo, seeking justice for a life that should have been. As the plaintiff, we bear the burden of proof in today's case. We must prove to you by a preponderance of the evidence, simply meaning more likely than not, that Harper Martini committed battery against Genesis Petrillo, which ultimately caused his death. The evidence will show that we will meet this burden and more. And it is for this reason that at the end of today's trial, my co-counselor, Mr. Matthew Schreiner, will ask you to find Harper Martini liable for the death of Genesis Petrillo. Because she had a problem, she had a plan, and she used the poison. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. And defense, the floor is now yours for opening statement.
Permission to proceed, Your Honor.
Please do. Thank you.
May it please the court, counsel, and members of the jury. This case was about an accident that turned out to be fatal. Tragedies happen all the time. Some people would call them accidents, whether it was accidentally running a red light, saying something unkind to a loved one that you wish you could take back, or waking up late to work. Accidents happen all the time. And on the night of the rehearsal dinner, there was a fatal one that no one saw coming or could have prevented, especially Harper Martini. This was a terrible accident that tore apart a loving family and nothing more. Good afternoon. My name is Randall Shirey, and I, along with my co-counsel, Dalton Davis and Michelle Deutsch, are here on behalf of the defendant, Ms. Harper Martini. Now, in today's case, the prosecution bears the burden of proof. They must prove to you through a preponderance of the evidence that Harper Martini is liable of battery. That burden rests solely at the table of the plaintiff. They must prove to you three things. First, that this was an act committed by the defendant, Harper Martini. Second, that this was an act intended to cause harmful or offensive contact. And lastly, that because of this act, Genesis Petrillo suffered harm. Essentially, they must prove to you, the jury, that in today's case, this was not an accident, but a harmful act perpetrated by Miss Harper Martini. We, the defense, have no burden to bear. We do not have to show anything. But throughout the course of today's case, we, the defense, will present evidence that points to the fact that this tragedy was simply nothing more than an accident. If the prosecution does not prove to you through a preponderance of the evidence that Harper Martini is liable for battery, you must side with the defense in agreeing that this was nothing more than a tragic, unavoidable accident. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what happened before Genesis Petrillo tragically passed away that night. The night of June 7th, 2019 was supposed to be a precursor to the day that this family had planned for so long. But it ended as the worst day anyone involved could have imagined. A soon-to-be husband, a beloved friend, and a soon-to-be son-in-law was lost that night. After months of planning, budgeting, and invitations, their big day was finally coming to fruition, and Harper Martini was happy to be a part of it. Harper Martini, through an act of love toward her daughter and soon-to-be son-in-law, did everything in her power to show an act of love the only way that she knew how. The rehearsal dinner was full of love, celebration, and happiness. But things, unfortunately, did not stay that way. Tragedy struck that night, and Genesis Petrillo was taken from his loved ones before his new life could even start. But it was not because of any act committed by the defendant that the plaintiff will attempt to lead you to believe, but rather a tragic, unavoidable accident. Now, during the course of today's trial, I urge the jury to pay attention to the common denominator of today's case shown through the testimony of three witnesses. You'll hear a lot about what they saw, but what they did not see is more important. There will not be one witness to come before you today that will testify that they saw anything to implicate Harper Martini of battery. First, you will hear from Harper Martini herself. She will tell you that even though her and Genesis had their differences as everyone does, she wanted to make amends for the sake of her beloved daughter and show them both an act of love. Second, you will hear from Dr. Cannon, who will tell you about the inconsistencies in the report of Dr. Kwan and how there were several variables left unaccounted for in Dr. Kwan's report, and that this could have easily explained the tragedy that happened that night. And lastly, you will hear from Blair Osborne, the wedding planner for Genesis and Casey's wedding. He will tell you about his business relationship with Miss Martini and Peonia Estates, but more importantly about that night, he will tell you that he did not see anything to implicate Miss Harper Martini. At the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Dalton Davis, will come before you and review all of the evidence and closing arguments. And when you consider all of these facts in deliberation, the evidence will show that this was a tragic, unavoidable accident and nothing more. At the end of today's trial, we'll ask you to do the right thing and find Harper Martini not liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. I'm going to switch myself over to gallery view here. And with that, plaintiff, if you are ready to proceed with your case in chief, you may call your first witness now.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we call Ms. Angel Rodriguez to the stand.
Ms. Rodriguez, and Counselor, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Oh, there we go. Good morning, or good evening, Ms. Rodriguez. Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, my name is Angel Rodriguez.
Ms. Rodriguez, what is it you do for a living?
Well, every day is certainly a surprise. But most days as a kindergarten teacher, I'm making sure the kids don't shove crayons up each other's noses. It can get pretty ugly.
What brought you here to Midlands?
Well, I moved here to Midlands in 2015 after getting an amazing job offer that I just couldn't pass up at Rapid Valley Elementary School.
Ms. Rodriguez, how did you first come to know Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto?
Being new to the area and all, I decided to put myself out there a bit more by attending a trivia night at a local bar where our mutual friend Drew introduced me to Genesis and Casey.
And how would you describe your relationship with the two after you met them?
After that night at the bar, we were like three peas in a pod. Genesis and Casey made a wonderful couple, just like Romeo and Juliet. And even though they were dating, I never felt like a third wheel, and we all got along. When they announced their engagement, I was so happy for them.
Were you involved in their wedding preparation at all?
Of course. I was pretty honored to be a part of a day which would be so special for the two lovebirds. Everything leading up to the wedding was going great. Well, that was until Casey's only parent, Harper, got involved. That's when things started to take a turn.
What about Harper's involvement changed the planning process?
Well, before Harper got involved, it seemed as if Genesis and Casey already had a plan for their dream wedding.
That's
But
Your Honor,
once
speculation.
Response, Counselor?
Your Honor, the witness is not testifying that the actual belief by the couple. She is simply stating what she observed and what she thought that the couple had planned their dream wedding. It was her present sense on the situation between the two.
Defense, it appears that that the plaintiff is saying that this is based on the witness's perception. What is your response to that?
Yes, Your Honor, for the witness to have this perception, she would have to speculate to the state of Genesis and Katie Soto's mind state in regards to their thoughts about the wedding process. And this would be speculation on her part.
Plaintiff, counsel for the plaintiff, do you think you'd be able to establish just a little more foundation as to how the witness came to this particular understanding?
Yes, Your Honor, I do.
Let's do that.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Rodriguez, what did your involvement in the wedding process look like, particularly in the events?
Well, I was really involved being their best friend and all. They kept telling me about their plans, and they originally had planned to have their wedding at Rosie and Pedro, which was special for the both of them. But then Harper got involved and changed the venue.
And who was it that changed, or how did the venue change happen?
Well, like I said, once Harper got involved, she decided that it was best for them to have their wedding at her own winery, Peony Estates. It was very surprising because, like I said, that Rosie and Pedro was special for the both of them.
Now, Ms. Rodriguez, how would you describe the relationship between the three, particularly between the defendant and Genesis?
It was pretty tense. They didn't always get along, especially.
Sorry, Renee, go ahead and repeat your objection, defense.
Yes, Your Honor. It was objection to speculation. Angel Rodriguez is speculating the relationship between Harper and Genesis.
Response.
Your Honor, the witness is simply stating that when she observed the two, it appeared tense when they were together. She is not saying that the relationship between them was tense. She was saying that when she witnessed it, it was a tenseful setting.
All right. I'm inclined to sustain the objection at this time. You know, you're welcome to re-ask the question again, but I believe for the jury they need a little more foundation to establish what the witness observed instead of the witness's interpretation of how Ms. Petrillo or the other parties felt. And you're welcome to proceed based on that. So the objection is sustained at this time.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Rodriguez, how did you observe the interactions between the defendant and Genesis Petrillo?
Well, leading up to the wedding, they were always arguing over the smallest things, whether it was the centerpieces, the flavor of the cake, the tablecloths, literally everything and anything. It got pretty tense sometimes, and the attitude caused a lot of problems between the three. Sometimes I felt like I was dealing with kindergartners all over again, because of all the petty bickering.
Mr. Rodriguez, do you remember what happened the next time you were with the three?
Yes, it's when we all got together at the Black Bear Hotel and Casino for, like a last little party. And after lots of drinking, Harper's name came up in the conversation. The next thing I knew, the two lovebirds had separated from each other, looking pretty upset, kind of like my students do when recess time is over. But when I tried asking Genesis what was going on, he said he had to make a phone call and just left.
Moving on, Ms. Rodriguez, could you tell us about the wedding rehearsal dinner?
How could I forget? As usual, Genesis and Harper could not stop fighting. At one point, Harper went as far as saying that Genesis should just leave and save this family the headache. Otherwise, I will make her disappear. After this harsh comment, I tried talking to Genesis, but he seemed very shaken up. He looked pretty afraid that Harper would harm him in some way.
When did you next see the defendant?
The next time I saw Harper, it looked like she was headed towards the kitchen with a canister that had the word pesticide on it. Out of curiosity, I asked Harper what it was for, and she responded that it was for Genesis because Genesis was such a pest.
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay to the label of the bottle.
Plaintiff, what's your response? The objection is the hearsay as to the label of the bottle.
Your Honor, I would want to believe that there's no truth value asserted here, as it is just a label on a bottle. There's no statement being asserted as far as truth to the matter.
If I may be heard, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Specifically, this is in regards to the canister saying pesticide on it. There's no evidence admitted that this canister existed or said pesticide on it. Therefore, this statement and the label would be hearsay.
Well, I believe in this occasion that it is possible to, with an appropriate limiting instruction, and I can provide such to the jury that states that that the witness's testimony isn't to go to the fact that there was actually pesticide on the bottle, but I believe that she's able to state what was written on the bottle, and since it's not hearsay in that fashion, I will overrule the objection with an appropriate limiting instruction.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Rodriguez, what happened after that?
She said she was just kidding, but I just thought that as I tell my students, you should never say something that you don't mean.
Ms. Rodriguez, what happened next?
Next came the speeches. Genesis gave a very positive and uplifting speech. I was very proud. But then was Harper's toast. I was pretty surprised by how Harper seemed to be mocking Genesis in her toast.
Did the defendant speak about Genesis anymore that night?
Yes, actually. Later on that night, Harper gave another toast towards Genesis. She even gifted him a bottle of wine. Everyone got a bottle, but Genesis was different. His said car on it, while ours said horizon.
Did anyone else but Genesis try the wine from his bottle?
I was the only other person to try it, but I immediately spit it out because it tasted weird. It kind of reminded me of the juice we give the kids after recess, but Genesis continued to drink it for some reason.
What happened after this, Ms. Rodriguez?
Well, it was getting pretty late, and Casey went to bed while the rest of us stayed up, and Genesis kept drinking from the car bottle. At around 11, Genesis was out of it, something I'd never seen before. He had slurred speech, out of whack coordination. He eventually started throwing up, sweating, had flushed skin. He couldn't even drink water without throwing it back up. The last thing Genesis said before passing out was 911.
And how did you respond to this?
I did what he asked. I called 911. At first, I decided not to tell Casey because I didn't want to worry her the day before her big day, which was supposed to be her wedding day. But once I was told that Genesis was in a coma, I went back to Peony Estates to break the news to Casey.
And what happened once you made it back to the estates?
I ran into Harper, and to my surprise, she said Genesis got poisoned. Oh no, we'll have to cancel the wedding. Go tell Casey. Casey needs to know. I thought it was pretty weird that before I even mentioned Genesis being in a coma, let alone anything about poisoned, Harper already knew. After that, I just went to Casey's room.
After you told Casey about Genesis' condition, what did you do?
We went back to the hospital, but unfortunately, we were too late. Genesis was already gone, and it breaks my heart that Casey didn't get to say goodbye to Genesis. And I just can't believe he's really gone. One of the peds from our paws is missing, and now will never be complete.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Counselor. In defense, if you would like to cross this witness, please do so.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Rodriguez, before I begin, I just want to ensure that you can hear me and see me clearly.
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Ms. Rodriguez, you were good friends with Genesis, as you stated on direct, correct?
Yes, we were like best friends.
And eventually, later on in the wedding process, you started to become less involved.
Yes, because Harper kind of took over, so I just stepped back.
And you were not too familiar with Peony Estates once the venue was switched.
No, I hadn't been there as much.
Now, moving on to the night of the rehearsal dinner, you were present at that second toast, correct?
Yes.
And you witnessed Miss Martini give a gift to Genesis, correct?
Yeah, it was pretty strange.
And this gift was a bottle of 2019 Cara wine.
Yes, it was.
Now, did Genesis offer you a glass of this wine?
I tried it, but like I said, I spit it out.
So just to be clear, you took a drink of this wine, the same wine that Genesis Petrillo drank.
Yes, it was a small sip that I spit out.
So that's a yes to my question.
Yes.
Now, did you feel sick after taking this drink?
No.
And I want to take us to a little bit later in the night. You rode to the hospital with Genesis.
Yes, I did.
And when you got the news he had slipped into a coma, you returned to Peony Estates to inform Casey.
Yes, I knew that Casey needed to know and be there for Genesis.
Now, you would say that you were still intoxicated when you returned to Peony Estates, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, to relevance.
If I may respond, Your Honor.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was unmuting myself there. Please respond.
Yes, Your Honor. Simply, this statement is perception of the events of that day, specifically going towards the line of questioning that there were other options to where Genesis Petrillo could have suffered his cause of death that night.
Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Please.
I'm not quite following. I don't believe it's relevant if Miss Rodriguez was drunk at the time that she returned to Peony Estates is relevant to the fact that there may be other options for Genesis's poisoning, as Miss Rodriguez was not present earlier in the day and may or may not have been drunk. Her return to Peony Estates drunk has no relevance to the fact of whether there could have been other options for his poisoning at the time.
If I may clarify my response, Your Honor.
Go ahead, Counsel.
Specifically, Angel Rodriguez still being intoxicated at 8 a.m. when she returned to Peony Estates would have drastically construed her rational perception that night.
So you're now clarifying your response to say that this goes to the witness's credibility?
Yes, Your Honor, I misspoke.
All right. And your response to that, Counselor for the plaintiff?
Your Honor, the counselor previously stated that it is relevant because it involves whether different options for Mr. Petrillo's poisoning. However, Ms. Rodriguez is not speaking or has not spoke to whether there were other options. She simply spoke that she returned to Peony Estates. Therefore, her being intoxicated at the time or not has no relevance to whether or not there were other options for his poisoning.
I'm ready to rule. Well, being in mind or keeping in mind that the credibility of the witness is always at issue in the case, I'm going to overrule your objection. But this could be an item to bring forward on redirect if you believe, in fact, that the witness's perception was not impacted by the level of alcohol that she consumed on that night. And Counselor for the defense, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Rodriguez, you would say that you were still intoxicated when you returned to Peony Estates at 8 a.m. that morning.
I didn't drink that much, so I don't know whether I was intoxicated. I don't believe I was. I felt fine.
Ms. Rodriguez, is it your sworn testimony that you felt fine when you returned to Peonia Estates at 8 a.m.?
Yes, it is.
That you were not maybe a little drunk?
I didn't feel drunk.
Is your sworn testimony that you did not feel drunk when you returned to Peonia Estates at 8 a.m.?
Well, that night's kind of a blur, so I honestly can't say with certainty whether I was or was not drunk.
So you do not know whether or not you were drunk?
I could have been, but I didn't feel drunk.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Counselor. Redirect for the plaintiff.
Your Honor, I have no further redirect at this time. I just ask that the witness be allowed to be excused.
Thank you, Counselor. And yes, the witness is excused. And plaintiff, you may
Thank you, Your Honor.
call your second witness.
At this time, plaintiff calls Dr. Jimin Kwan to the stand.
Dr. Kwan, and you may proceed when ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please introduce yourself to the court.
Sorry. Hello, my name is Dr. Jimin Kwan.
What do you do for a living?
Well, chiefly, I'm the father of 7 wonderful little munchkins, as well as being the chief emergency physician at River Valley Hospital in Midlands.
Well, how long have you worked there?
I've worked there for about 20 years now, and for that reason is why I'm one of the leading experts on toxicology in Midlands.
Well, what kind of education do you need to be an ER doctor?
Well, I received my bachelor's in science, minoring in chemistry, received my MD at UNC Chapel Hill, completed my residency at Emory's Department of Emergency Medicine, and completed my fellowship in toxicology under J.T. Seaver.
Have you ever been published?
Oh, yeah, many times. Several articles on toxicology and the effects on the human body subsequently from that, and countless articles on emergency medicine.
Do you have any other qualifications?
Yes, I'm on the board of Doctors for Organic Solutions, an organization that advocates against the use of chemical pesticides as they present a needless and immense danger to people.
Dr. Kwan, how are you involved in today's case?
Well, I was the ER doctor who treated Genesis Petrillo from the 7th to 8th of June.
What materials were you given to come to your conclusions?
I was given all relevant exhibits along with Petrillo's toxicology report.
Were these materials sufficient for your findings?
Yes.
Dr. Kwan, what method did you use today?
Well, I used the gold standard for diagnosis, which starts with an interview, followed by a physical examination, and finally concluding with laboratory testing.
Is this method standard?
Yes. Me and my colleagues use this every single day in the field, given it's the golden standard.
Now, I'd like to break those things that you mentioned down one by one, starting with that interview. How did that go?
Right. So Petrillo arrived at the hospital with their friend Angel Rodriguez, which in the following conversation with Miss Rodriguez and what I could gather from Petrillo, they had been drinking that night, after which I made Petrillo to the hospital for alcohol poisoning.
Well, what symptoms was he exhibiting?
Slurred speech, stomach cramps, tightness in the chest, nausea and vomiting. However, this wasn't really cause for concern.
Well, why weren't you concerned?
Well, while his symptoms might seem severe, I wasn't concerned Petrillo was any real danger, as I brought along this alcohol impairment chart to better explain this.
Would you recognize that chart if I showed it to you in court today?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Schreiner, could we get Exhibit 23 on the screen? Noting for the record that this is constructively outside the eyeshot of the jury until it has been published. Now, Dr. Kwan, what are we looking at here?
Well, right now we're looking at an alcohol impairment chart that details the symptoms and effects on the human body from alcohol consumption.
Is this a fair and accurate depiction of alcohol impairment?
Yes.
Have any changes or alterations been made to this since the last time you saw it?
No.
At this time, plaintiff offers Exhibit 23.
Defense, any objections to this exhibit?
Yes, Your Honor, as to hearsay, if I may be heard on the matter.
Please.
Your Honor, while this witness is an expert and he can rely on outside inadmissible hearsay testimony, pursuant to the case law of Richards versus Mississippi Barbecue, an expert witness can't bring into court inadmissible hearsay as a conduit. That's essentially what's occurring here because these statements are being offered for the truth. These are actually the symptoms of alcohol poisoning.
Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Please.
This document actually falls under hearsay exception 8034 as it is being used for medical diagnosis or treatment.
Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Yeah, go ahead.
No foundation has yet been laid that this specific document was used in the process of treating Genesis Petrillo. While it has been used to essentially describe how the doctor came to conclusions in today's case, it hasn't been described for the specific treatment on the night of June 8th.
Your Honor, I'm sorry. May I be heard?
Please.
According to Rule 703, Dr. Kwan does not actually have to disclose how he used this inadmissible hearsay, which actually is not inadmissible hearsay as it is falling under 8034.
Do you believe that you'd be able to establish any foundation for the use of this document in treatment?
Your Honor, I believe that Dr. Kwan actually already stated that he used this document to determine whether or not Genesis was in a high-risk area.
All right. Being as this is, in my opinion, a little bit borderline, I'll go ahead and allow it at this time, and you may proceed. So your objection is noted, and we will go ahead and tender Exhibit 23 into the evidence.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Kwan, when you assess Genesis, where would you say he fell onto this chart?
Well, Petrillo fell around the high-risk area, that normal-colored orange area, which doesn't mean high risk of death, as I wasn't really worried until the physical examination occurred.
Well, what did you learn from the physical examination?
Well, I learned quite a lot. So at this point, I admit Petrillo to the hospital, checked their vitals, and he couldn't walk, continuous and profuse vomiting, and other symptoms, which led me to believe that this wasn't the open and shut case of alcohol poisoning that I once thought this was.
Thank you, Mr. Schreiner. You can go ahead and stop sharing now. Now, what led you to believe this wasn't the open and shut alcohol poisoning case you thought it was?
Well, there were three main things. Firstly, Petrillo's pupils were severely constricted, the opposite of which happens in alcohol poisoning cases where they instead dilate. Secondly, he experienced involuntary muscle twitches, which is inconsistent with alcohol poisoning. And thirdly, the pulse was very, very slow. Again, inconsistent with alcohol poisoning, where it's very, very rapid.
Well, what are these symptoms indicative of?
Well, these symptoms here would be indicative of organophosphate poisoning.
Now, Dr. Kwan, for those of us who aren't scientists, what exactly is an organophosphate?
Well, an organophosphate is simply just a pesticide, a chemical compound designed to kill insects, which, as you can imagine, doesn't work wonders for the human body.
Could you tell the members of the jury, what are the risks associated with pesticide poisoning?
Well, the main problem is that they inhibit the production of an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which is a fancy way of saying this leads to nervous system failure.
What were your next steps?
Well, I immediately ordered a lab test to start running to confirm my suspicions.
Were you able to get that test back in time?
Not before Petrillo's death. However, the symptoms were so consistent with this type of organophosphate poisoning that I felt justified to administer the antidote. But even then, I was too late.
Well, did you ever get that test result back?
Yes, we did. And the results confirmed low levels of cholinesterase in the plasma, which is how you can tell about the low levels of acetylcholinesterase production, and a presence of organophosphates in his stomach.
How does one get exposed to organophosphates?
Well, there are three main ways. There's inhalation, skin contact, and ingestion.
Well, did you ever figure out how Genesis was likely exposed to the poison?
Yes, we subsequently tested the wine in Petrillo's stomach and found it contained organophosphates, showing that the wine was indeed the source of the pesticides.
Well, what did this lead you to believe?
Well, from this, I concluded that Petrillo ingested wine containing the organophosphates, corroborated by the testing, and ultimately and tragically caused their death. Now, this time frame also suggests that it was the pesticide within the wine, as it's logistically unlikely that it came from another source.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, Counselor. And defense, you may cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Kwan, before we begin, I just want to make sure that you can see and hear me clearly.
Yes.
Now, let's talk a little bit about your experience as a doctor. Now, you're the chief medical physician at the Rapid River Valley Hospital, correct?
Yes.
Now, in addition to your role as a doctor, you actually work for a nonprofit, right?
Yes. I serve on the board of directors actually for it.
That's right. You're on the board of directors for Organic Solutions, correct?
Yes. Doctors for Organic Solutions, but yes.
Right. And that's an advocacy group that fights against chemical pesticides, correct?
Yes.
specifically chemical pesticides like organophosphate pesticide, right?
Yes.
And it's your hope that by testifying in today's trial, you'll bring attention to the dangers of this type of pesticide, right?
Well, of course. As seen in this case, this led to the death of a young man who had his whole life ahead of him.
Specifically, you want this to bring attention to legislators, right?
Yes.
Bring it to their attention that there will be an outright ban on organophosphate pesticide, correct?
Hopefully.
Objection, Your Honor, to relevance.
Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Yes, please.
This goes to the bias of the witness, and bias and credibility is always at issue.
Yeah, I believe it's pretty clear that this line of question goes to the bias of the witness, so I will overrule your objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Dr. Kwan, it's your hope that your testimony will cause the legislators to place an outright ban on this type of chemical pesticide, right?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Kwan, let's shift gears for a minute here. Let's talk about some of your conclusions in today's case. Now, first, let's talk about why you found the low levels of acetylchlorinesterace to be significant in Genesis's system. Now, you hold that low acetylchlorinesterace indicates that someone's been exposed to an organophosphate pesticide, right?
Yes.
And specifically, Genesis had a low acetylchlorinesterace, correct?
Low cholinesterase in the plasma, but yes.
Right. And so essentially this indicated to you that there was probably some organophosphate pesticide in Genesis's system.
Yes, and that was further corroborated by the organophosphate presence in their stomach.
Now, organophosphate can have serious symptoms, right?
Yes.
Even just a tiny amount can cause deadly consequences, right?
Well, it depends on how far it gets into the system. So in regard to, so you would have to like absorb it into the body. Yes.
Right. If an individual consumed just a tiny amount, it could have devastating consequences.
Yes, if they consumed it.
Like the amount that might remain on food after it's been sprayed with pesticide.
I'm sorry, you cut out for a bit for me.
Like the amount of pesticide that would be on food after it's been sprayed, correct?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Kwan, I'd like to ask you about one of the tests you ran on Genesis. You ran a stomach content test, right?
Yes.
And in that test, you looked at what was all inside of Genesis's stomach at the time of death, right?
Right.
And you found that even if there had been any food there, it had probably been dissolved by Genesis's stomach acid, right?
Yes.
And specifically, all the contents were so churned together that the organophosphate pesticide was spread evenly throughout, right?
I wouldn't say so, as we were able to isolate the wine from the stomach contents.
You know, Dr. Kwan, you are aware that wine is made from grapes, right?
Yes.
So essentially, there were contents of grapes in Genesis's stomach, right?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Kwan, I'd like to talk to you about one more thing. Now, you weren't actually at Peonia Estates on the night of June 7th, 2019, were you?
No, I was at the hospital.
You didn't see what Genesis was doing that night?
No, but I got from the report of Angel Rodriguez or not the report, sorry, not testimony, them telling me that they were at the rehearsal dinner.
Right, but Angel Rodriguez wasn't with Genesis that whole night, was she?
I don't believe so.
So you don't know what Genesis was doing that whole night, correct?
Not exactly.
You don't know if he went in other rooms other than where the rehearsal dinner was at?
Not that I know of.
Now, Dr. Kwan, I just have one more question for you. If Genesis had gotten organophosphate pesticide from some other source, that could hypothetically have been the cause of death, correct?
Hypothetically, but not likely given that the organophosphates were only found in the wine.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Counselor. Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just ask that this witness may be dismissed.
Absolutely. Dr. Kwan, you may be dismissed. And I guess we are now ready to move forward with the plaintiff's third witness.
Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Miss Casey Soda.
Ms. Soda, I see you there. And plaintiff, you may proceed when ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, my name is Casey Soda.
Why are you here today, Miss Soda?
Well, I'm here because I was subpoenaed to testify in the lawsuit against my mother and her winery, Peonia Estates.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing. I grew up in Midlands with my mother, Harper Martini. When I was little, my mom was the only one who was around. She was the only one in the front row at my school plays. I mean, I wasn't even a lead, and she still showed up every single night. During my childhood, though, she could be very controlling.
In what way was she controlling?
Although she was well intentioned, she sometimes took things a bit too far. When I first moved in my college dorm, she showed up every weekend to ask me questions about where I was going and who I was hanging out with.
And was there a reason for this?
She didn't want to miss out on anything, which was great when I was younger and only had her to rely on.
Could you restate your objection, please, Counselor? Your audio cut out just a bit.
To speculation, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, what was the object of the speculation, Your Honor?
Why? Permission to be heard, Your Honor.
Please.
Why Genesis always showed up to, why the speculation goes to why Genesis always showed up.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Please.
Your Honor, we're simply trying to establish, I believe that Ms. Soto would be fairly qualified to be able to speak on the relationship that she had with her mother and how her mother felt towards her. So I don't believe that this is speculation.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I'll overrule your objection and go for it.
Thank you, Your Honor. But let me re-ask my question. Was there a reason for this, Ms. Soto?
Well, yeah, like I was saying, I was the only one in her life. And when I was younger, it was great to have someone that could be there and be my rock. But later on, I came to rely on Genesis for that support too.
And when did you first meet Genesis?
I first met Genesis in 2012 at a party our friend Drew Metsukas was having for one of his college buddies. I'm actually a pretty shy person, and Genesis was the life of the party type, so I was instantly attracted to him.
And what happened after your first meeting?
Both of us pretty much talked only with each other the entire night, which surprised me because I thought he would lose interest in me. The more I found out about him, the more I liked him. We were basically attached at the hip from then on.
When did the defendant first meet Genesis?
I knew that it would be a shock for her, so I waited to take him home to meet my mom. I was worried about the meeting because they were the two most important people in my life, and I wanted everything to be perfect.
And was everything perfect?
No, far from it. I wanted nothing more than for my mom to get along with Genesis.
How did the defendant feel about your relationship?
My mom had issues with Genesis from the very beginning. We both tried to smooth things over with her, but that didn't matter.
What do you mean it didn't matter?
My mom was always complaining about Genesis and how he wasn't respectful. She was worried that he was going to break up our family, even though that wasn't at all what I wanted.
And how was your relationship with Genesis after this meeting?
It went really well, as long as they weren't around each other. When Genesis surprised me with his proposal, I was thrilled. It was actually kind of funny because I was planning on proposing anyway. I'd read this article that said women needed to be more assertive and just go for it.
And how did the defendant react to the proposal?
She freaked out. I thought we could plan the whole wedding ourselves so we wouldn't stress her out, but that's the opposite of what ended up happening.
And what did end up happening?
Harper happened. Genesis and I were planning on having the wedding at another local winery, Rosie and Pedro, where we had first met. But instead, my mom took control of everything.
What do you mean she took control of everything?
She planned the entire wedding to be at Peony Estates.
And how did Genesis react to the defendant's offer?
He was uneasy about it, but he did think that my mom offering to pay for the wedding was a nice gesture. What really pushed their already rocky relationship over the edge was our pre-wedding party.
What happened there?
We had a final party for our friends in May at Black Bear Casino. I've never had much luck gambling, but everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves, and at the time, I thought the night was a success.
And what made you change your mind?
A couple days later, my mom played me a voicemail that Genesis had left her the night of the party. We had quite a few drinks that night, and Genesis was drunk when he left the message. And while I was honest, it was a bit harsh.
How was it harsh?
Genesis let my mom know that we were planning on going to France after the wedding, but he said it when he was drunk, so it didn't come across well.
And how did the defendant react to this voicemail?
Horribly, she told Genesis to reconsider his plans. She said I had to stay in Midlands with her, and she didn't care if Genesis stayed or ended up 6 feet under.
And what happened next?
I tried to talk to my mom about it, but she was really stressed out, which is what I was worried about from the beginning.
I'd like to talk about the rehearsal. Can you tell us about that day?
I was really nervous. At the rehearsal, my mom was snapping at Genesis for being just a few minutes late. And that's when I considered giving up and canceling the whole wedding.
And what was Genesis's reaction to your hesitation?
Genesis completely understood, but wanted nothing more than to be with me for the rest of our lives. He was worried that my mom might try something to hurt or embarrass him, though.
And how did the defendant take it?
She surprised me. I thought that she would be upset because of all the wedding planning, but she acted like all her problems had just gone away.
Could you walk us through what happened at the dinner?
The dinner was great. My nerves were starting to dissipate until later that evening when my mom surprised both of us.
How did she surprise you?
It seemed like she was trying to extend an olive branch. She gave Genesis a bottle of wine.
And did Genesis drink any of the wine that night?
I saw him pour a couple of glasses. I know for sure one of them was for him. I didn't stick around. I knew he would stay up and party, so I kissed him goodnight and went back to my room.
I'd like to talk about the next day. What happened then?
I was getting dressed early, around 7 or 8. My mom came in and said Genesis couldn't be found anywhere. She said this was a sign that Genesis had bailed. I refused to believe it and kept getting ready.
Could you tell the jury about what happened or when you found out to Genesis?
It wasn't until Angel rushed in that I heard that Genesis was in the hospital. My first thought was this had to be some kind of joke, but when I saw the look on Angel's face, my heart just sank.
What did you do next?
I rushed to the hospital with Angel. We were 5 minutes too late. I just immediately thought of Peony Estates when the doctor was telling me about pesticide poisoning.
What made you think of Peony Estates?
My mom mentioned using pesticides before the wedding. I had the exact same food as Genesis at the dinner. The only thing I didn't have was the wine that my mother gave him.
No further questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Defense, you may cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to proceed.
Please.
Good afternoon, Ms. Soto. Before we proceed, I just want to ensure that you can see and hear me.
Yes, I can.
Now, let's first talk about your relationship with Harper. Growing up, Harper made it to every school play of yours, correct?
Yes, she was always in the front row. She was my rock when I was growing up.
And every soccer game, isn't that right?
Yep.
In fact, Harper regularly brought you baked goods and dorm decorations while you were in school.
Yeah, when I moved to college, she was there every single weekend, which started to show me that I needed to step away.
And you mentioned, though, that Harper was always well-intentioned, right?
Was, yes.
Now, fast forwarding to 2019, Harper did a lot for your planning your wedding, such as picking out the colors, the chairs, the flowers, etc., correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. May I be heard?
Please.
I don't see how any of these questions make any of the facts of the case more or less likely.
Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Please.
The plaintiff opened the door for this line of questioning during their direct examination.
Could you elaborate on how they opened the door?
They discussed the wedding plans extensively, specifically how Harper Martini was involved.
And Counsel for the plaintiff, the defense is asserting that you opened the door into basically the relationship between Harper Masoto and the wedding planning. Do you have a response to that?
Your Honor, at the time, this was simply to establish some points for further questions in our argumentation.
All right, I will overrule your objection and note that I agree that the door was open to this line of question. So please proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Harper did a lot for the wedding, such as picking out the colors, the chairs, the flowers, etc.
Yeah, I mean, she planned the entire wedding to be at Peony Estates. We originally were going to have it at Rosie and Pedro, but she changed it and took control of everything.
Now, I'd like to direct your attention to the rehearsal dinner. At around 10 p.m., Harper came out with a bottle of wine, isn't that correct?
Yeah, the Cara bottle that she was going to give Genesis.
And it was for Genesis.
Yeah, she was going to give it to Genesis, yes.
And Harper toasted Genesis, isn't that right?
Yep, she did. She made a toast. It actually sounded sincere to me, which I was happy. I thought she might be trying to turn over a new leaf.
Now, I'd like to talk specifically about the wine. You did not see the bottle of wine before it was presented, right?
No, I didn't.
So you do not know what Harper did with that bottle of wine.
No, I mean, she came out with it and gave it to Genesis.
You don't know if Harper put anything into that wine.
No, I don't.
You wouldn't know if pesticides were put into that bottle.
I mean, I heard that Genesis was poisoned by pesticides, and the only thing that Genesis drank at that dinner that I didn't drink was the bottle of wine.
Redirecting you back to my question, you wouldn't know if pesticides were put into that bottle, correct?
Not with 100% certainty, no.
Based off of what you know, this was just a normal bottle of wine, isn't that right?
I don't know what you mean by a normal bottle of wine.
Based off of what you know, this was a bottle of wine.
Well, it was a new bottle actually, because my mom, she had this new thing of grapes, and she decided to have the special wine Cara. She named it. She actually asked me what I thought I should name it, and I told her Cara. So,
But as far as you know, all that was in this bottle was wine, correct?
no.
No further questions.
All right, thank you, counselor. And plaintiff, do you have any redirect? I realize that you might be a bit tight on time.
Your Honor, no redirect. Thank you. We just ask that the witness be dismissed and we rest our case in chief.
All right. Well, the witness may be dismissed. And if no one has anything right now, are both parties comfortable with a brief 5-minute break? Are we okay
Yes, sir.
for that?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Well, I have 3:10 right now. I will give the benefit of my clock, maybe having passed a couple seconds, so we'll call it 3:16 if we get everyone out back by 3:16. All right, folks, my clock just turned over to 3:16. So plaintiff, if I could have a representative from the plaintiff to let me know that everybody is back.
Yes, Your Honor, we're all back and ready to proceed.
All right, defense, are you ready and ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense would like to call Harper Martini to the stand.
And one more question I have, Judge Russ, you're back with us and ready to proceed as well?
I'm here.
All right, wonderful. And defense, yes, please call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor.
And you may proceed when ready.
Good afternoon, Ms. Martini. Now, before we begin, I just want to make sure that you can see and hear me clearly.
Yes, I can.
All right. Now, could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hello, my name is Harper Martini.
Ms. Martini, what do you do for a living?
Currently, I'm the owner and operator of Peony Estates in Rapid River Valley, Midlands.
What is your connection to today's case?
I'm here because my daughter's fiance, Genesis Petrillo, died on the day that Casey was supposed to marry Genesis. And I'm here to talk about what happened.
Now, before we get into all that happened that day, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your operations at Peony Estates now and your relationship with your daughter. First, can you tell the members of the jury about your relationship with Casey Soto?
Casey's my only daughter. I love her with everything I have. We've always had a terrific relationship, at least until she met Genesis. We were inseparable. I love her dearly.
Now, Miss Martini, when did you get into the winemaking business?
Well, the summer after my junior year of college, I got a job at Cumberland's Farm Winery. I've been in the winemaking business ever since.
Now, when did you start operations at Peony Estates?
I officially opened Peony Estates Winery and Bed and Breakfast in January 2015.
Let's fast forward a little bit. When did you first meet Genesis Petrillo?
I first met Genesis in 2015 when Casey first brought Genesis home.
Now, based off what you understood, how did Genesis impact your relationship with your daughter, Casey?
Honestly, it made me feel like Casey didn't want to spend time with me. Their relationship really strained Casey and I's relationship, and it just made me really sad. Like I said, this is my only daughter, and I love her dearly. Our relationship means everything to me. I tried multiple times to work things out, but it didn't really get anywhere.
Now, what happened after you found out Casey and Genesis were engaged?
Well, I was very surprised at first. When I first was introduced to Genesis, Casey didn't tell me they were dating. So I only found out that they were dating and then they were engaged very quickly after that.
Well, Miss Martini, when was the wedding planned for Casey and Genesis?
It was planned in 2019.
Now, let's talk about a little bit about the essentially the events leading up to the wedding. Now, prior to the wedding happening, you actually operated Peony Estates, right?
Yes.
Now, let's talk a little bit about specifically what the operations were like prior to the wedding. What did running the vineyard entail?
Yeah, so running the vineyard involves growing our own grapes, bottling our own wine, and even giving tours of our vineyard when we can. There's a lot of processes that go on at the winery.
Now, throughout the course of your winery, did you ever run into any trouble while growing your grapes?
The only trouble that we ran into was pests. We had a little bit of a pest issue in the vineyard.
Now, how would you go about using your pesticide?
We would spray the vineyard with the pesticide that we used. If we noticed pests in the kitchen area, we would take everything out of it and spray that down as well before we brought things back in the kitchen area. So yes.
Now, let's talk about what other events took place on your property in addition to the practice of growing grapes. What types of events would take place at Peony Estates?
We would host weddings pretty often. Everyone loves the property. Blair is the typical wedding planner, and she does a terrific job. We also have a bed and breakfast and offer tours, like I said before.
Now, Miss Martini, in addition to hosting different tours and things like that, where would you essentially store your harvested grapes on your property?
We would store the harvested grapes in a...
Relevance, may I be heard?
Let me unmute myself, please. Yes.
Your Honor, I don't see how any of these points being made about the storage of the wine and the growing of the grapes have anything to do with battery in this particular case. I would argue that they lend themselves more towards possibly negligence.
In your response?
Yes, Your Honor, if I may proffer, this witness is going to go on and testify that on the morning of June 7th, 2019, she had a conversation with Genesis Petrillo in the harvesting room where they kept untreated grapes that were sprayed with pesticide. And later on, I also proffer that later on that night, this witness saw Genesis Petrillo walk into that same harvesting room where the sprayed grapes were kept prior to passing away later that evening.
All right. Yeah, I'm inclined to overrule the objection. As I understand, you're establishing that the defense in this case is that there was another cause other than the battery. So based on your proffer and your ability to demonstrate that through testimony, I will overrule. So let's see how it goes.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Ms. Martini, where would you store the grapes on your property? Untreated grapes, excuse me.
We would store the untreated grapes in a room accessible from the kitchen and the main dining area that we host main events in.
Now, let's transition away from how exactly you would store the grapes and different processes at your property. Let's talk specifically about the wedding of your daughter. How did that weekend start out?
It started out just setting up for the wedding. I was working alongside Blair. Everyone was working really hard to get things set up in order for the wedding.
Now, what time did Genesis arrive on the morning of the 7th?
Genesis arrived about 15 minutes late that morning.
What happened when you met Genesis?
When I met with Genesis, I was trying to remind him how important this day was supposed to be to him and how important it was for Casey. It was really weird, though. He kept looking over to the grapes in the room that were untreated. They had just been harvested. And I thought it was kind of rude considering I was trying to explain how important this day was, and he wasn't paying attention.
Now, Ms. Martini, just to be clear, this conversation, did it take place in the room where you kept your harvested grapes?
Yes, it did.
Now, let's move on to a little bit later that day. After that conversation with Genesis, what did you do?
After that, I just got back to working in preparation for setting up the wedding. There was so much to do, I really didn't have time to stand around.
Now, let's talk about the rehearsal dinner. What happened during the rehearsal dinner?
During the rehearsal dinner, I toasted Casey. I said how immensely proud I was of her and the person that she's become. Then I gifted Genesis the bottle of Cara wine, and I gifted the rest of the guests the bottles of our Horizon wine.
Now, at around what time that night did you leave the rehearsal dinner?
I headed up to bed at around 10:30 that night.
Miss Martini, as you were leaving the rehearsal dinner, did you notice anything unusual?
Yes, actually. As I was leaving, I saw that Genesis was walking into the room that we kept the recently harvested grapes, and about a minute later, he came walking back out.
Well, what was Genesis doing when he walked out of your harvesting room?
He walked out of the room with something in his hand, and it also looked as if he was chewing something, eating something maybe.
Now, just to be clear, was that the same room where you talked with Genesis earlier in the day?
Yes, it was, where we keep the untreated harvested grapes.
Now, essentially, let's move on a little bit to later in that night. What happened later on that night? What did you hear about?
Well, I'm sorry, what part of the night are you referring to?
After the rehearsal dinner, what did you find out had happened?
I found out that Genesis was taken to the hospital.
Miss Martini, I just have one more question for you.
Yes.
Best of your knowledge, do you have any idea how Genesis Petrillo ended up passing away?
No, I have absolutely no idea how Genesis died. I'm honestly just sad for my daughter, Casey. This is terrible. I never would have wished for something like this to happen to her.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you, Counselor. And Plaintiff, you may cross.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hello, Ms. Martini. Did you plan in advance to give the bottle of Cara wine to Genesis?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And you saw Genesis drink the bottle of wine on that night, correct?
Yes, I did.
All right. And eventually you threw that bottle away afterwards, right?
I did. I found it empty in the room when I went upstairs to their room, and I didn't see a reason to leave an empty bottle lying around.
Okay. And how many types of pesticide are used at Peony Estates?
Just one.
Just one. And were you aware of the fatal effects of consuming this particular organophosphate?
Yes, I was.
You even had an employee suffer from pesticide poisoning before, right?
Yes, and it was actually terrible. That's when we realized the danger of the pesticide and really tried to practice safe usage of the pesticide.
Right. And in that particular case, were there any visual signs of the pesticide in the wine?
No, there were not.
Okay. You were incredibly close to Casey, correct?
Yes, I was.
And you didn't approve of the relationship between Genesis and Casey?
No, I didn't. I knew the real reason that Genesis wanted to marry Casey, and so I did not approve from the beginning when I found out.
And you told Casey what you thought of Genesis on several occasions, right?
Yes, I did. I told her that I really believed that Genesis was using her just to marry her.
You also told Genesis what you thought of him as well, correct?
Yeah, I told Genesis that I knew he was only marrying Casey to get legal US citizenship, and he wanted to hear nothing of it.
You're familiar with the voicemails that you left to Danny Francasio, correct?
I'm sorry, that who left?
That you left for Danny Francasio, correct?
Yeah, yes, I am.
Okay. If I were to show you those voicemails in court today, would you be able to recognize them?
Yes, I would recognize them.
Your Honor, permission to show exhibits 18A through 18E to the defendant?
Yes, constructively doing so outside the presence of the jury.
Yes, Your Honor. All right. And are these true and accurate transcriptions of those voicemails?
Yes, they are.
Right. And have any changes been made to them?
No, not that I'm aware of.
The plaintiff offers exhibits 18A through 18E, Your Honor.
Any objection to these exhibits?
No, Your Honor, since these are the statements of the defendant, they would fall under the hearsay exception.
All right. Then we will consider 18As through 18E, if that's correct, entered into evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. And Miss Martini, in these voicemails, you complained about Genesis's behavior to Danny Francasio several times, correct?
Yes.
You said that Genesis was a nightmare.
Yes, we really didn't get along.
That someone needed to shut Genesis down?
Yes, I was concerned about him marrying my daughter.
You likened Genesis to a cellar pest, correct?
Yes, because as I stated before, Genesis was only marrying my daughter to get US legal citizenship as he was a French resident, and his student visa was going to expire soon.
Miss Martini, it's your testimony that Mr. Petrillo attempted to marry Miss Soto to gain legal US citizenship?
Yes, it is.
And you remember having a deposition for this case, correct?
Yes, I do.
If I were to show you that deposition, would you be able to recognize it today?
Yes, I would.
All right. Permission to show the defendant her deposition, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Sorry, 1 second.
Your Honor, I would just ask what purpose this document's being shown for.
Plaintiff, the defense is asking your purpose for showing the document.
Yes, Your Honor. I don't believe that anywhere in the deposition Miss Martini says anything about this particular point of gaining legal U.S. citizenship, and I would like the defendant to point to me to where in her deposition she stated this to be true.
All right. So it sounds to me that he's using it for impeachment purposes.
Yes, Your Honor. All right, and Ms. Martini, this is your deposition, correct?
Yes, that is.
And there have been no changes made to it based on what you can see?
No changes, no.
Fantastic. Can you point me to where in this deposition you say that it is your testimony that Genesis Petrillo was marrying Casey Soto for the purposes of legal U.S. citizenship?
Well, I didn't mention it in my deposition because they didn't ask me about it.
Okay. No further questions on this line, Your Honor. So you heard the voicemail that Genesis left you on the night of the Black Bear Casino party, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And you showed several people this voicemail, right? You played it for them?
Yes.
Okay. Permission, Your Honor, to show Exhibit 8, which is pre-admitted.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Right. And within this particular voicemail, your response was that you were upset about Casey and Genesis moving to France, correct?
Yes.
And you wanted Casey to stay in Midlands with you.
Yes, I did.
When you found out about Genesis's death, you were relieved, correct?
Yes, I was relieved.
And are you familiar with, I'm sorry, this exhibit, there's no longer use for this exhibit. You may take it down. Thank you. Are you familiar with the note that you left Genesis as well?
Yes, I am.
All right. If I were to show you this note today, would you be able to recognize it?
Yes, I would.
Okay. Permission to show Exhibit 24 to the plaintiff, Your Honor?
Constructively doing so outside the presence of the jury.
Thank you, Your Honor. Is this a true and accurate depiction of the note that you left Genesis?
Yes, that is.
Have any changes been made to it?
No, no changes have been made.
The plaintiff offers Exhibit 24, Your Honor.
Any objections from the defense?
No, Your Honor, since these are the statements of the defendant, they would fall under the hearsay exception.
All right, then we will enter Exhibit 24.
Thank you, Your Honor. And there was $300,000 enclosed in this note, correct, Ms. Martini?
Yes.
That $300,000 was intended to be an incentive for Genesis to leave Casey, correct?
Yes, it was.
And you stated in this note that if this money wasn't taken, you would take Genesis out of the picture the hard way, correct?
Yes, meaning I would call ICE and get him deported.
To redirect you back to my question, you said you would take Genesis out of the picture the hard way, correct?
Yes, those were my words. Mm-hmm.
Okay, no further questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Counselor. Any redirect from the defense?
Your Honor, briefly. Now, Ms. Martini, you were just asked about a note you wrote to Genesis Trillo.
Yes.
Why did you write that note?
I wrote it because I was just concerned for Casey. She said it was love, but I could see the real reason why Genesis wanted to marry her. And it was the last thing I wanted to see my daughter be used that way.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any recross?
No, Your Honor.
All right, well, with that, the witness may step down, and then defense, you may proceed with your second witness.
Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Cannon to the stand.
Dr. Cannon, and you may proceed when ready.
Thank you. Dr. Cannon, before proceeding, I just want to ensure that you can see and hear me both clearly.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Would you please state your name for the court?
My name is Dr. Rachel Cannon.
What do you do for a living, Dr. Cannon?
I'm a medical doctor with both expertise in toxicology and pharmacology.
Why are you here in court today, Dr. Cannon?
I was hired by Harper Martini's attorneys on April 2nd, 2020 to assess the results and work of Dr. Jameen Kwan, specifically with regards to the death of Genesis Petrillo.
Now, before we talk about Genesis Petrillo, I'd like to ask you about your experience. Could you just tell the members of the jury about your educational background?
Yes, I received my bachelor's of chemistry in 1990 from The Ohio State University and furthered my education by receiving my medical doctorate with an emphasis in toxicology from Harvard Medical School in 1996.
Now, in addition to that educational background, could you tell the members of the jury about your work experience?
Sure. I was hired at the Massachusetts General Hospital as the chief toxicologist during my time in Boston. I worked there for 10 years before I moved on to take the faculty position at Midlands Medical School. I taught there from 2005 until 2014, and after that, I left to become an associate with Gardner Consulting.
Now, in addition to that work experience, have you ever been scholarly published?
Yes, I have been published in over 50 articles on various topics, ranging from the treatment of patients, various types of medication, and toxicology.
Now, Dr. Cannon, have you ever testified as an expert in trial?
Yes, during my time at Gardner Consulting, I've testified in over 35 legal cases.
Now, let's shift our focus for a minute. What is the purpose of your testimony here today?
I was hired by the defense counsel to review the conclusions of Dr. Kwan, and I informed them of my conclusions as to the likelihood to the cause of death of Genesis Petrillo.
And informing those conclusions in today's case, what, if any, methods did you use?
I applied the basic analytical toxicology method to review the conclusions that Dr. Kwan came to.
And are these methods you used generally relied upon by other experts within your field?
Yes, they are.
Are those methods reliable?
Yes, they are.
And did you have both sufficient facts and data to conduct your investigation?
Yes, I did.
Now, were you able to take that to apply those methods to form those conclusions in today's case?
Yes, I was able to use these methods to come to a conclusion of a reasonable degree of scientific certainty within my field.
Now, Dr. Cannon, let's talk about some of those conclusions you made. Did your conclusions differ from those of Dr. Kwan?
Yes, they did. I disagree with the conclusions of Dr. Kwan that the organophosphate pesticide in the wine bottle necessarily caused the death of Genesis Petrillo.
And how did you come to this disagreement?
During Dr. Kwan's examination of Genesis, there were several key possibilities that were overlooked. Specifically, Genesis Petrillo's blood alcohol content, the unknown medical conditions of Petrillo that may have had maybe due to infrequent checkups, and the possibility of a different source of organophosphate pesticide.
Now, what other aspects of your examination of Dr. Kwan's report and his conclusions led you to believe that organophosphate pesticide was not the only way that Genesis Petrillo could have died that night?
Petrillo did not have regular checkups, and there were several unaccounted for variables that could have caused the death that night. In fact, he did not have blood work done 3 years prior to the wedding. Individuals can often develop allergies and medical complications later in life. Additionally, to my understanding, the empty wine bottle that Petrillo consumed that night was later tested positive for isofenfos organophosphate pesticide, but no test can conclude to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that it was in the bottle of wine that night.
Now, is it possible to conclude to a degree of scientific certainty that organophosphate pesticide was in the wine that Petrillo consumed that night?
It is impossible to conclude to a degree of scientific certainty that the organophosphate pesticide was present in the wine that Petrillo consumed that night.
Now, what evidence, if any, did Dr. Kwan provide in his report that suggested this was the only possible cause of death?
The only evidence found in Dr. Kwan's report to suggest this is the presence of wine and organophosphate pesticide in Petrillo's stomach at the same time. This is not conclusive, as these substances could have entered at 2 different times.
Now, what could have caused this organophosphate pesticide poisoning that led to Petrillo's death?
Several things. First, having dealt with several pesticide poisoning cases, these pesticides are commonly used in produce farming and often found when unwashed produce and fruits. Ingestion of these unwashed vegetables and fruits could explain the presence of organophosphate pesticide in Petrillo's stomach.
Now, is it possible that something other than the Cara wine was consumed that night that could have contained this organophosphate pesticide?
Yes, it is possible. Through Dr. Kwan's testing and analysis, it is impossible to conclude to a degree of scientific certainty that organophosphate pesticide was present in the wine consumed by Petrillo that night. There are too many alternative explanations that were not explored in his original report, such as the possibility of organophosphate pesticide being introduced through a different vehicle, such as unwashed produce or fruits.
Now, finally, Dr. Kwan, what was your final conclusion after assessing the report of Dr. Kwan and his conclusions?
My final conclusion was that there are far too many variables and flaws with the theory that the bottle of Cara wine given to Genesis Petrillo by Harper Martini contained organophosphate pesticide, and that this pesticide was the cause of Genesis Petrillo's death. It is impossible to conclude to any degree of scientific certainty that the conclusion of Dr. Kwan was accurate.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. No further questions.
Thank you, Counselor. Plaintiff, the witness is yours to cross.
Thank you, Your Honor. Before I begin, I would simply like to read Stipulation 9 onto the record, which states all leftover food and beverages, alcoholic and otherwise, from the June 7th, 2019 rehearsal dinner were tested, and those tests found no organophosphate or any other poisons or abnormalities. Now, Dr. Cannon, you work for Gardner Consulting Firm, is that right?
Yes, I do.
And you charge a $50,000 flat fee for your consulting services?
Yes, that's the normal fee in consulting.
You've only ever testified for the defense, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And what you do is you take the state's expert report and you provide a second opinion,
Yes, that is correct.
charging $50,000 for that opinion every single time.
Yes, that's our normal fee.
Now, you have a client known as Detsky Roach and Rodent Killer, is that right?
Yes, that is one of our clients.
And they actually instructed you for today's case not to find a pesticide responsible.
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay. If I may.
Your Honor, may I request clarification on what exact statement opposing counsel is objecting to?
Of course, the instruction by Detsky Roach and Pest Products would be hearsay.
Your Honor, I don't believe I'm eliciting a specific statement, simply that they instructed her not to find a pesticide responsible.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. It didn't sound like a specific statement, or that they said something in particular, more in line with a general statement or something that would influence the witness's credibility. So, yeah, I will overrule the hearsay objection at this time.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, I'm going to repeat my question. They instructed you not to find a pesticide responsible for today's case, didn't they?
That is correct, but my results were objective.
No, you really don't want to lose Detsky as a client, do you?
We wouldn't want to lose him as a client, but my results, again, are objective. And if we do lose them, then that's just a loss we'll have to take.
Because it would cost your firm a lot of money to lose them, wouldn't it?
It would.
Now, you were hired by Harper Martini to assess the work of Dr. Jimin Kwan, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And Dr. Kwan is the attending physician who treated Genesis Petrillo the night and morning of June 8th.
Yes, that is correct.
And you'd agree with me that Dr. Kwan found pesticides responsible for her death.
Yes.
But you take issue with this conclusion, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Because you think there are other possibilities as to how she could have passed away.
Yes, that is true.
And I'd like to break those down one at a time, starting with alcohol poisoning. Now, you're aware that Genesis was initially admitted for alcohol poisoning.
Yes, that's correct.
But Dr. Kwan ruled that out pretty quickly.
Yes, she did.
Because you'd agree with me that Petrillo's symptoms were completely inconsistent with alcohol poisoning.
Yes, they were.
They were actually more in line with pesticide poisoning, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, you'd agree with me in saying that the lowest BAC that you've ever seen cause an alcohol poisoning fatality is 0.3%.
Yes, that is correct.
And you'd also agree with me in saying there's zero evidence that Genesis's BAC ever even came close to that point, right?
Whenever he was tested, his alcohol point, like your blood alcohol, is the highest 30 minutes after consumption. So Genesis was not able to be tested at his highest BAC.
But just to be clear, Dr. Cannon, there is no evidence that Genesis's BAC ever even came close.
That is correct.
His BAC tested at 0.16, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, now I'd like to move on to another alternative you mentioned, an allergic reaction. Now, you'd agree with me in saying that had Genesis suffered an allergic reaction, there should have been some sort of physical marker that she was having that reaction, like a rash or some kind of inflammation, right?
Yes.
And none of this was noted in Genesis's chart.
No, it was not.
You'd agree with me in saying that Genesis had no known allergies.
No, he did not, but he had not been to regular checkups in the past 3 years. So they could have developed later.
And an allergic reaction wouldn't explain Genesis's low levels of acetylcholinesterase, would it?
It would not.
Now, a third potential cause of death you mentioned was liver disease, but you don't know why this would have been fatal on its own, do you?
No.
In fact, the only explanation that you can provide us as far as the fatality of liver disease is that it could have flared up due to exposure to pesticides.
Yes, that is correct.
Now, the final alternative that you provided was that Genesis could have ingested this pesticide through some other vehicle. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
You would agree with me, though, that the bottle was, in fact, the only item of food or drink that tested positive for organophosphates, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And had Genesis ingested that organophosphate at a different time, he likely would have exhibited symptoms at that time, right?
Correct.
Now, there were organophosphates found in Genesis's stomach the night of June 7th.
Yes, that is correct.
And that was mixed with the wine?
They could have entered at 2 different times. There's no way to really test to see if it was
Directing you back to my question, that was mixed with the wine?
Can you repeat that?
The organophosphates were mixed with the wine in Genesis's stomach. Is that correct?
Yes, they were when they were in the stomach. Yes, that's correct.
The bottle of wine that later tested positive for pesticides?
Yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, Counselor. And any redirect?
Brief redirect, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Cannon, within Dr. Kwan's report, was there any notion that that grapes stored in the harvested room?
Objection, Your Honor, outside the scope of my cross.
Kind of proper, Your Honor. Or if I may respond, I'm sorry.
Can you establish how this is within the scope of the plaintiff's cross?
Yes, Your Honor. This is specifically asking where this organophosphate pesticide may have come from, which was a conclusion reached in Dr. Cannon's report, which she explored previously, and which was asked on cross.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, but please keep it limited. So your objections are.
Of course,
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, restating my question, Dr. Cannon, was there any indication within Dr. Kwan's report that any food outside of the rehearsal dinner, such as stored produce, was tested for this pesticide?
No, it was not.
No further questions.
Thank you. And the witness may step down, and defense, you may call your third witness when ready.
The defense now calls Mr. Blair Osborne to the stand.
Mr. Osborne.
Good afternoon. Before we proceed, can you see and hear me clearly?
Yes, I can.
Please state your name for the record of the court.
Yes, my name is Blair Osborne, and I like to party.
Please briefly describe your occupation for the jury.
Yeah, so I work as a private event planner in Rapid River Valley, Midlands. I'm the founder and owner of Bliss by Blair events. I arrange numerous events ranging from anniversaries, birthdays, corporate events, you name it, I arrange it.
Mr. Osborne, how did you get into the event planning business?
Well, during school, grades and I weren't really the best of friends. So most of my experience comes where you would expect, parties. I said, hey, I like to party, so why don't I plan them?
Can you please briefly describe how you came to know Harper Martini and Peony Estates?
Yeah, so I met Harper Martini in the spring of 2015. I had a conflicting schedule, 2 events in the same venue. So I reached out to local venues. Peony Estates finally contacted me and said I could have it there. And then since then, we've had a good relationship.
How would you describe your partnership with Peony Estates?
Yeah, so from spring of 2015 until June 7th of 2019, I've hosted over 80 events at Peony Estates for lunches, hey, even a funeral. And but trust me, if I'm planning it, it's still going to be a good time. The staff over at Peony Estates have always been attentive and diligent. They've helped me with any problems with clients or guests over the years. And since then, we've still had a good relationship up until the 7th.
When did you first meet with Harper to discuss Genesis and Casey's wedding?
Yeah, so we met on October 12th of 2018.
And how did that meeting go?
It was good. Harper seemed overall happy with my work, and we agreed strongly on numerous things.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about Peony Estates Winery. How would you describe the atmosphere at Peony Estates as a venue?
My experience working with them and the venue have been nothing but fantastic.
Mr. Osborne, can you please elaborate on that?
So after years of working with Peony Estates, their staff has always been very diligent and attentive, like I said before. They make my job a lot easier when planning events. They don't let me have extra worry.
Were you involved in the wedding of Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto?
Yeah, so like I said, I was Harper Martini called me and asked me to plan their wedding. I accepted without hesitation. They're basically like family to me. So it was important that to both the rehearsal dinner and the wedding went off both without any problem.
Did you see anything out of the normal at this rehearsal dinner?
No, I didn't. I mean, I pride myself on the work, ensured that every aspect of the wedding that was under my control was orderly and accounted for. If something was out of place or someone was breaking my rules, I would have known about it.
Now, how did that rehearsal dinner go?
Well, besides some back and forth banter between the soon-to-be groom and the in-law, it was a great time. Just like everything I'm responsible for planning. Harper ended up giving a beautiful bottle of wine to the groom. It was great to wrap up the rehearsal dinner.
Who drank from this bottle of wine?
I don't remember exactly who drank from the bottle of wine. I definitely saw Genesis pour 2 glasses of it. I'm not sure if the second one was for him or not, though. I mean, this bottle of wine would have been better to enjoy with friends.
Mr. Osborne, what time did you leave the rehearsal dinner?
I ended up leaving the rehearsal dinner around midnight that night.
Finally. I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I left around midnight.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Osborne, did you see anyone get ill that night?
I did not, no.
No further questions.
Okay, thank you, Counselor. And plaintiff, the witness is yours to cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening, Mr. Blair.
Good evening.
You would consider yourself a successful business person, right?
Yes, I pride myself in my business.
You've planned and coordinated numerous successful events in the past,
This is true.
including several weddings.
Yes.
But this one had a few oddities that set it apart, right?
What are you referring to specifically?
This wedding just wasn't like any other wedding you'd done in the past, correct?
Correct. We typically get to the wedding part.
Particularly, one of those oddities was the fact that the bride and groom had no idea you were planning their wedding.
At the beginning, I wasn't sure on what Harper had told Genesis and Casey specifically.
Mr. Blair, the only family member that knew you were planning the wedding was in fact the defendant, correct?
At the time of me being hired, that was what I perceived to be true.
In fact, the defendant even paid you extra to stay discreet.
Harper gave me a little bit of a higher percentage. That wasn't odd of her to do, but yes.
So it wasn't odd for a family member to pay you to plan a wedding for an extra 15% to prepare for it in secret?
I mean, we were like family, so I'm guessing she just wanted to be really generous.
Now, Mr. Blair, you didn't meet with the couple, Casey and Genesis, until about 6 months before the wedding, correct?
Yeah, in January.
And following this meeting, you observed several instances of disagreement between the defendant and Genesis.
This is true.
And this conflict continued regularly up until the time of the wedding.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Blair, you said earlier, you're good at what you do.
Guilty.
And you've planned several successful weddings, 61 of them to be exact, by the time of the Petrillo wedding.
At the Peonia Estates, yes.
And this one was one of the more chaotic ones, right?
Yes.
Maybe the worst wedding you've had in your professional experience.
This is true.
Would you say the main problem with this wedding was the disagreements between Harper and Genesis?
Can you repeat the question?
Would you say that the main problem in this wedding that made it more chaotic than the rest were the disagreements between the defendant and Genesis?
Yes, the bickering that they had did make my job a little bit more difficult.
Now, you met with Casey and the defendant on May 11th, 2019, correct?
Can you repeat that?
You met with Casey and the defendant on May 11th, 2019, correct?
The party of the Blackberry Hotel and Casino?
No, I'm referring to a personal meeting between you and the defendant on May 11th, 2019.
I recall the meeting. I'm not sure what the date was, though.
Now, during this meeting, Harper played a voicemail loud in your presence, correct?
Correct.
This voicemail was from Genesis.
Yes.
And from what you could tell from what you heard, he was clearly drunk.
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
And Harper's response to this voicemail was, one of these days, Genesis will drink the wrong thing and it will kill Genesis, correct?
That's what she said.
Surely this must have seemed fairly odd to you.
I mean, yes, but I didn't know the context of the statement, so.
Mr. Blair, directing you back to my question, it seemed fairly odd to you for the defendant to say this, correct?
Yes,
Now, you were present at the rehearsal dinner,
I was.
and the defendant and Genesis were arguing constantly.
Leading up to it, yes.
In fact, there was almost a whole day of constant disagreements and insults between the two.
That could be said, yes.
Then the defendant suddenly became cordial to Genesis.
Yeah, Harper toasted Genesis with a bottle of wine.
And as you said, gifted him a bottle of wine.
Yes.
I'm sure this was a relief after all the previous conflict, right?
Yeah, I didn't think it was going to be as sincere as it was, but it was a great gesture.
Yes, but this sudden change of heart must have been quite unexpected to you.
It was unexpected, but I had in my schedule that Harper would gift everybody something. I just didn't think it would be as genuine as it was.
Mr. Blair, directing back to my question, it was quite unexpected to you, the sudden change of heart that the defendant displayed towards Genesis.
That could be true after the arguments that they both had been in.
Now, Mr. Blair, you found out about the death of Genesis the morning of the wedding, correct?
Correct.
And you witnessed the defendant being told of Genesis's death.
Yes.
The defendant had no response to this news.
No.
No shocked verbal expressions.
No.
No verbal outburst.
No.
The defendant remained silent upon the news.
Yes.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, Counselor. Any redirect?
Not at this time, Your Honor. I just asked that my witness be able to step down.
The witness may step down. And defense, does that conclude your case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor, that does conclude the defense's case in chief.
All right. How are we doing on time, folks? Are we doing okay?
We've got a lot of time.
Okay. All right. Do we want to do let's call it a 7-minute break? Does that work for everyone?
That works for us.
All right. So I've got 3:58 right now. So let's come back at 4:05. All right, folks. Well, I've got 405. Plaintiff, do we have everyone back?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, and for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor, we're ready.
And Judge Russ, are you back with us as well?
I'm here.
All right, so I've already got myself in speaker view here for all of our audiences at home, and I hope you all do as well. And with that, we are ready to move forward with closings. Plaintiff, just so you know, the court is going to assume that you want to save any time that you have remaining for rebuttal. And with that, Plaintiff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Honor. Today, we heard the story of a loving couple who wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. Genesis Petrillo and Miss Casey Soto were ready to live their lives together as a loving couple. However, this wedding that they had dreamed of was broken up by the acts of the defendant, Miss Harper Martini. Because you see, Martini had a problem, she had a plan, and she used the poison. It is the duty of the plaintiff in today's case to establish a preponderance of evidence. Now, essentially what this means is that the events that occurred must be more likely than not to have occurred in order for the evidence to be sufficient to conclude that those situations did occur. We can imagine this as two buckets of water on the scales of justice. If there is a single teardrop's worth more of evidence against the defendant than for her, then you must find the defendant liable for battery against Genesis Petrillo. Additionally, we must illustrate the prongs of battery in order to prove that Ms. Martini was the actual wrongdoer in today's case, and did this harm of battery against Genesis Petrillo. Again, those three prongs are an intent to harm the plaintiff, an act that was done, and finally, actual harm done to that particular plaintiff. But let's begin by talking about the intent to harm. Throughout the witnesses brought up by the plaintiff in today's case, we were able to establish a clear dislike of Genesis Petrillo by the defendant, Ms. Harper Martini. Angel Rodriguez was able to state multiple situations where she heard Ms. Martini say things about Genesis Petrillo and about how much she disapproved of her relationship with Casey. Ms. Soto herself was also able to corroborate this evidence in her testimony. But additionally, both Ms. Soto and Ms. Rodriguez were present on separate occasions to hear the voicemail that was left for Harper Martini by Genesis Petrillo at the party at the Black Bear Casino. This particular voicemail, as we heard, specifically noted that Genesis told Ms. Martini that he was planning to move to France with Casey Soto. And the reaction of the defendant to this voicemail, according to Ms. Soto, was one of anger, being upset at Genesis Petrillo, and additionally afraid of losing Ms. Soto to leave to France and move away from her winery. So as we can see, in this particular case, there is a clear intent to cause a harm. Ms. Martini herself even enumerated multiple different reasons why she disapproved of the relationship between Genesis and Casey, so much so that she even threatened to call ICE on Mr. Petrillo. As a result, the intent here to harm Mr. Petrillo is clear. This is the first prong of battery. The second prong that we must illustrate is an act by the defendant, that something wrong was actually done. Based on the testimony of Ms. Rodriguez, we were able to see that she witnessed Ms. Martini actually heading to the kitchen with a bottle labeled pesticides. We can conclude then that she had the pesticides with her in the kitchen and with the bottle of 2019 Carl wine. Immediately afterwards, Ms. Martini gifted this 2019 bottle of Carl wine to Mr. Petrillo, extending a sort of olive branch that actually ended up being the undoing of Mr. Petrillo. Ms. Soto and Ms. Rodriguez noted this particular gift as odd and out of character for the defendant. But most importantly, we were able to see that Dr. Kwan stated in his testimony that we can conclude to a reasonable degree of scientific proof that the root of these pesticides was actually from the wine itself. That is where the pesticides found in Genesis's stomach came from. So we can see that there was an actual act done by the defendant. But then third and finally, was the harm actually done? And we can see that this was also correct as well. Ms. Rodriguez drove to the hospital with Mr. Petrillo early on the morning of his death. When she returned to tell the members of the party about the coma situation that Mr. Petrillo was in, Ms. Martini made a particular statement that made it clear that she was aware that Mr. Petrillo was poisoned without Ms. Rodriguez ever sharing that information in the first place. Additionally, we were able to see through the testimony of Dr. Kwan that the symptoms that originally seemed to be of alcohol poisoning were later found to be clearly of pesticide poisoning. The toxicology report that he ordered later officially proved this to be the cause of Genesis Petrillo's death. The defense brought up Dr. Cannon to illustrate the numerous other possibilities that could have occurred, but rather, as shown by the cross from Ms. Addison Pruitt, we saw that these numerous possibilities were so unlikely that rather Dr. Cannon illustrated for us how much more likely it was that the actual root cause was found in these pesticides to be the death of Genesis Petrillo. So as a result, we had actual harm done to the plaintiff. That is the third and final element of battery proven. Your Honor, members of the jury, opposing counsel, we have shown for you today that there was clearly these three prongs of battery met by a preponderance of evidence. As a result, we ask you to find Ms. Harper Martini liable for the battery of Genesis Petrillo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Counselor. And defense for your closing argument.
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to proceed?
Please do so.
May it please the court, counsel, and members of the jury. This case is about a tragic, unforeseeable accident. Members of the jury, accidents happen every day. Whether we forget to send a text message to a coworker, we accidentally spill our cup of coffee on the way out, or we accidentally forget how long it's been that food's been sitting in the refrigerator, and we end up getting food poisoning because of an accident. Members of the jury, that's exactly what happened in today's case. Genesis Petrillo died because of an unforeseeable accident of eating grapes that he never should have. Members of the jury, unfortunately, Genesis died because he accidentally ate those grapes. At the beginning of today's trial, my co-counsel, Randall Shirey, came before you and told you to be on the lookout for three specific things. First, he told you to listen as the defendant, Harper Martini, took the stand, and she took you through the events of what happened that night. Think back to what Miss Martini said. She talked with Genesis Petrillo on the morning of June 7th, 2019, and saw Genesis eyeing the vat of grapes she had in her harvesting room. Think back to later that night where she saw Genesis leaving that same room with something in his mouth, and then it looked like he was chewing on it. Next, you heard from Dr. Cannon. And as my co-counsel said, when she took the stand, she told you about the different testing procedures that occurred on Genesis that night. But think back to redirect examination. What Dr. Cannon said was that Dr. Kwan never considered the possibility of there being some sort of other source, like harvested grapes or produce. Members of the jury, and finally, you heard from Mr. Blair Osborne. Mr. Osborne told you about what he saw that night and how, to the best of his knowledge, he never remembered anyone getting sick and that Genesis poured 2 glasses of the Cara wine. Now, members of the jury, you heard when Angel Rodriguez took the stand that she actually took a sip of that bottle of Cara wine, the wine that supposedly was contaminated with pesticide. But she didn't get sick. And in the words of the plaintiff's own expert, that just a tiny amount, a trace amount, was enough to cause someone to have catastrophic consequences. Members of the jury, is your role in today's case, it's your job as the fact finders to decide what actually happened. Now, in today's case, the plaintiff bears the burden. They must prove to you by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant is liable for battery. Now, in order to do this, they must prove to you 3 things. First, that the defendant committed an act. Second, that that specific action resulted in unwanted conduct and offensive contact, and that that contact resulted in harm towards the defendant. Members of the jury, let's look back through all the evidence we've seen in today's case so we can get a clear picture of what actually happened on June 7th, 2019. And first, let's look at the action itself. Now, the plaintiff has contended that Genesis Petrillo gave a poisoned bottle of wine, or Harper Martini gave a poisoned bottle of wine to Genesis Petrillo. But think about that night, members of the jury. Think about what Genesis was doing in the hours before he was rushed to the hospital. He was seen walking out of the room where recently harvested grapes were stored. Grapes, like Miss Martini said, would have pesticide on them before they were treated. And members of the jury, if you find that something else caused that pesticide to enter into Genesis's system, other than the bottle of wine that Harper Martini gave to Genesis on that night, then you must find the defendant not liable. Because in that situation, it would not be the defendant's actions that caused the death of Genesis Petrillo. Second, members of the jury, throughout today's trial, a lot's been said about the bad relationship between Harper Martini and Genesis Petrillo. Now, that goes to the second element of, did the defendant actually intend to cause harmful contact? You heard from the defendant when she took the stand, the reason why she didn't like Genesis, she thought he was taking advantage of her daughter by forcing her to marry Genesis just to get U.S. citizenship. Members of the jury, Miss Martini didn't necessarily like Genesis Petrillo, but that doesn't mean she tried to kill him. Rather, she extended an olive branch, like you heard Casey Soto say when she took the stand, that her mother was trying to make amends with Genesis. Unfortunately, that rehearsal dinner turned into a tragedy before anyone knew what was going on. Genesis started getting sick. And as you heard from Dr. Kwan, his condition continued to decline. Before the treatment even kicked in, Genesis passed away. Members of the jury, this was an unforeseen tragedy that no one expected. Now, because the plaintiff has failed to meet their burden, that it is the most likely outcome that the defendant caused the harm to Genesis Petrillo, we ask you to do the right thing, to bring all the evidence together and look at the picture of what actually happened on June 7th, 2019. And I'm confident that when you go back into that jury room and think back on everything that was said in today's trial, there's only one conclusion you can come to. We ask you to find the defendant not liable, because in today's case, it was a tragic accident that no one could have prevented. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Plaintiff, the floor is now yours for any rebuttal.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I first have a time check to see how much time I have for my rebuttal? Two minutes exactly. Okay, thank you so much. May I proceed, Your Honor? Okay, thank you. Your Honor, opposing counsel wants you to believe that accidents happen. And yes, accidents do happen. But in this case, intent layered every single action brought about by the defendant. There was no accident. Everything here done was planned from the very beginning. Your Honor, members of the jury, we ask you to find Ms. Martini liable for the battery of Genesis Petrillo because she had a problem, she had a plan, and she used the poison. The opposing counsel wants you to believe that this was simply an accident because of three pieces of evidence. That Genesis Petrillo was seen chewing on something, that previously Petrillo had been looking at grapes, and finally, that those grapes may have been in contact with pesticide. Your Honor, members of the jury, we are taking an extreme leap in logic here to assume that the death of this particular individual was brought about by these grapes simply because those grapes might have had pesticide on them. Genesis Petrillo might have wanted to eat those grapes, and Genesis Petrillo might have actually eaten one of those grapes. That is far too much to assume, and by a preponderance of evidence standard simply fails the burden in today's case. Your Honor, they mentioned the testimony of Angel Rodriguez where she stated that she had tasted the wine, but the reason why Angel Rodriguez did not feel sick was because she spat the wine out as she testified herself. She did not swallow it and therefore was not subject to the actual illness the pesticide might have caused. And Your Honor, while disliking someone doesn't mean that you will kill that individual person, Ms. Martini directly bribed and threatened Genesis Petrillo, as we saw in my cross-examination. So as a result, members of the jury, I want you to take a look at the facts. Harper Martini had an intent. She took action and she created a result. She had a problem, she made a plan, and she used her poison. For these reasons, we ask you to find Harper Martini liable for battery against Genesis Petrillo. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. All right, well, now Judge Russ and I are going to finish up with our score sheets and all that great stuff, and then we'll come back for comments in just a couple of minutes. Judge Russ, if you could, let me know either over the audio here or via chat, either way, when you have submitted your score sheet. Thank you.
All right, I'll let you know.
Thank you. All right, folks. Well done all around. We've both submitted, and I've gotten confirmation from the tournament staff that everything's been received. So before moving on to comments, I just wanted to say across the board, kudos to both teams for a really well-argued trial. It was super entertaining for me as a judge, so I hopefully it was for you as attorneys and witnesses as well. And because I'm tired of talking and seeing my own face, I'm going to invite Judge Russ if she would like to provide comments first.
Sure. I'll just give a couple general comments. The rest of my more specific ones you'll get on the comment sheet. But for attorneys overall, I thought your objection arguments were very clean and to the point, which I really appreciated. They were easy to understand. I would just say, remember to let the judge ask you to respond. A lot of times you were really eager to just jump in there. So just take a moment to breathe and let the judge ask you where your argument's going. For cross, make sure that your questions, you can make them as short as possible and as specific as possible and as directly from the affidavit as possible, so that you can really tie the witness down to that. Sometimes your questions were a little vague and the witness was able to say, well, what do you mean by that? And then you just repeated your question, which doesn't make it any less vague. So make sure you're able to really hold the witness down to an answer. Those are my general comments. Overall, I thought everyone did a really good job.
And Judge Russ, real quick, could you introduce yourself to everybody just so they...
Hi. Yes, I am a 2L at Wake Forest. I did mock trial in both high school and undergrad at USC.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm also a law student at Wake Forest. I'm a third-year law student here. So my first comment right off the bat, this is the first time that I've seen the this trial as a battery, and I found that to be pretty interesting. Definitely saw a lot different use of witnesses, a lot different use of evidence, and saw some evidence that I wasn't sure how it would come to light, and sure enough, it did. So that was pretty interesting to see. My comments generally, and off the top to both sides, really professional, really clean, really well argued cases on both sides. I have no idea how my scoring came out on this. I have no idea how an actual jury would decide this case. I think both sides, for all attorneys and for all witnesses, really well done and really, really well presented. On crosses, you all did a wonderful job in bringing forward evidence and bringing forward points that helped your side on cross. You used cross to help move across what you needed to come forward on closing, and that is a really advanced technique. So, really well done on both sides for that. My critique, if I were to give one, I think that sometimes on directs, witnesses felt a little bit scripted or felt a little bit like that they were responding to questions that they had a pre-recorded answer that they were going to go with. And of course, that's something that will sort itself out as the season progresses, and you all become more comfortable with having kind of a conversational tone between the attorney and the witness. But overall, really well done. Hopefully everyone is very pleased with the way that you did this afternoon. I know that for kind of a last trial in a tournament, so it's a good chance to try something a little bit different. And I hope, it seems at least that that's what you all decided to do, and it was really well done. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for putting on a great show for Grace and I. It was wonderful to see everything take place. And if anyone has any kind of questions or anything like that, please, the floor is all yours. Feel free to ask anything that you would like.
I would just like to say first, thank you all for your time and judging us on a Sunday afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It was fun for me. So, this is a great way to spend a Sunday, and I'm glad I got to see you all. And thank you all for taking part in the tournament. And hopefully you learned a lot. And I wish you all the best of luck moving forward. All right. Well, if that's it, then thank you all, and enjoy the closing ceremonies. And